Hello everybody, and welcome to day 10 of 28 Days to Master Level Chess Tactics. Today is the first day that we're going to get into Decoy, and over the next 3 days we'll go into more complicated examples, and then a final test, of course. Now, in this position, we're just going to jump into a very basic position explaining what decoy is, essentially. So a decoy is just where you basically make a sacrifice, or you take a piece or a pawn, and you essentially force the king or another piece onto kind of a poisoned square. Now, of course, the king does not want to be here because there's this knight fork, but if the bishop takes the knight, then the king is forced to take, and then you do get this knight fork and you win a bishop. So this is just a very basic example to show what decoy is. All right, now I'm going to give you 2 test positions to go through this. In this position, it's black to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so in this position, you'd start off, of course, evaluating the material, and, well, I guess it looks like white does have an extra pawn or 2, maybe, but the problem in this position is this uncastled and otherwise centralized king. Now, it's good to centralize your king in an endgame, but if you do that in the opening and the middle game, you're going to suffer a pretty quick loss normally. So in this position, you can see that the rooks are disconnected, and the queen's sitting over here in Siberia, as Daniel King would say. So that should lend you to forcing variations. Now, the bishop is cutting into the f1 square, as well as e2 square, which is probably the reason that white couldn't castle. And it looks like white was busy snapping up some pawns in the meantime. You have this rook that can swing into quick action, either on the E, the C, or the F file, and so you should look at something either queen takes bishop or rook takes on F2. Now obviously if the queen takes here, then the pawn just takes, and though you do have somewhat of an attack on the F file, you just gave away your queen for a bishop, and that's not a good trade. But rook takes f2 is a very interesting option because the bishop can't take, and that makes your calculations a lot easier. Now, f2 is kind of a poison square in this case, because now you play rook to f8 check, and now if the king has to go away from the bishop, he doesn't have any other squares. I mean, the bishop could come here, but you just take with the rook anyway, and you'll get a quick mate. For example, bishop interposes, rook takes, if he goes here, then you get checkmate right away. And if he goes here, then, well, you just checkmate with the queen on e3. Queen to e3 checkmate. Rook cutting here. And if the king, let's say he actually goes back, which is a little more stubborn defense, well, you just take the bishop, and it looks like it's a mate in 4 from here. King over, check. You bring the rook in. The queen could get in the way, I guess, delaying it 1 move. But after here and then check, the queen comes back and you get a final checkmate. Now notice this sad position with the rooks otherwise doing nothing to defend the king. Now the king could go to g3, but you still get a check, and it's a little longer, but I would just probably prefer just to keep checking. I guess the bishop could come in on a move, and which is kind of a waiting move. But let's say you wanted to keep giving checks, so check here, and if the king, well, the king goes here, then you check with the bishop. If he goes here, you check, and you'll get a pretty quick mate anyway, with the bishop coming back to c8, pawn comes, and then you checkmate on g4. So as you can see from the beginning of this position, rook takes f2 is a decoy because it draws the king to the poison square, and thus the open f file, where black can bring his last active piece into the game, and it's just too overwhelming. Basically, the king is defending against a rook, a queen, and a bishop, because even though on the board are these pieces, the position of them is just so bad they have absolutely no way to defend the king. And notice that this pawn, as I talked about in my video, the Tal Spiridonov video, that, you know, Philidor is saying the pawns are the soul of the chess, but actually piece activity is the soul of chess, and you can see that here clearly because the pawn actually blocks this 4th rank where the queen cannot defend the mate on g4 that could eventually happen in this position. So in this position, it is a rather complicated example, but it's white to move if you want to pause the video and do some analysis before we get into it. All right, so I would recommend that in this position, you don't necessarily have to calculate every single variation, but I just want to cover a kind of complicated and higher level example of a decoy. So I just want you to focus on getting maybe the first and the second move right, just to see the main idea, and then we'll just look at some variations together because there could be a lot in this position. All right, so you notice that the material looks like pawns. He has one pawn. Looks like white is down some pawns apparently, and otherwise the minor pieces are equal. But it looks like white has been busy sacrificing pawns to open lines. White does control the C file as well as the D file, and it looks like the king is a little bit exposed with the pawn on H5 cutting in a little bit, as well as these minor pieces ready to potentially make some sacrifices. So the variation that I would like you to see in this position is the simple knight takes f6. And now notice if the bishop takes, then you just simply take on d7 and you just fork the king and the bishop, winning, I guess, some material back, as well as completely opening the position for an attack on the king. As I said, there's many lines that could happen from this, and we're not going to look at all of those, but I just want you to get that main idea of a decoy. Now, when you see these kind of ideas, you see that there's only, obviously, bishop can't take, because then that actually opens up black, and it helps you win your material back with some advantage. So the only move you'd have to look at after knight takes is king takes f6. Now, logically, this should kind of give you some sense of opening the king, getting an attack, and just driving the point home that the poison square of f6. Now, it looks like the king is not so exposed, but he's much more exposed than he was one or two moves earlier. Now you follow up with rook takes d7, and let's just look at some lines here. So you've basically completely destroyed the pawn cover of black, and it does look like the advantage is plus 11 for white. So I guess the queen could come in, and you just have many options in this position. Now you can look at those, but I just wanted to include this position as a more complicated example of decoy. All right, so let's go through here. You could always take the bishop with the rook and I guess win some material back, but that would kind of fizzle out your attack. Although that's actually what it suggests, the computer. You could do queen to b2 check. Now there's actually a lot of ways to attack in this position, and none of them are wrong. So let's say king to f7. It's even saying you could just take here and then you get a check. So as you can see, that evaluating that king takes f6 is just so bad for black in a general way, and that's where the kind of complicated tactics come in, where there's lots of variations, and maybe you'd spend 20 minutes sitting there calculating it, but your intuition can be trained by these kind of positions as well to get the first or second move correctly. And then maybe you analyze some lines with the computer, and you'd go back and you just visualize how you would kind of finish the position from a more general understanding. All right, let's just go back here. So as you can see, your intuition in this position should be to break the pawn cover and decoy the king to f6 in a more vulnerable spot. All right, so hopefully this wasn't too much information in this video. I just wanted to give a kind of overview of the basics to the advanced of decoy, and I'll see you in day 11. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.